As you guys are finishing up your prayers together, I'd invite you guys to open up your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians. How many of you guys have ever been tempted to quit something that mattered a great deal to you? You just were tempted in a moment to quit, to give up on a relationship, to give up on a dream or a goal, to give up on a project. How many of you guys have ever been tempted to quit on something that mattered a great deal to you? I remember, it's been like 20 years ago now. It seems like a long time ago, but I was trying to figure out how to get hired on the fire department. And I was already married and had our 2 little girls and had a mortgage and was trying to make ends meet and was trying to get hired on the fire department for a lot of reasons, which I've sorted out over years, but one of the things was just really practical. I wanted to be able to provide for my family, and it was really hard. I went through a fire academy, which was grueling. I was working full time and going to fire academy, and I was like in my late 20s, which to then I felt old. Now I realize I was just a baby, but most of the kids that were in there were like 18, and I was like 10 years older than them, and so it did feel like, man, I'm too old for this, even at 28, and staying up all night studying, and then going through all these things, visiting fire stations, buying a suit for my first time, and so that I could go to these fire stations with my suit on and try to impress them, and then figure out how to take tests, and they had these like weird psych tests at the time when you would go there, and I couldn't figure out how to pass them, and I would drive all over the place, wasting time and money and resources and time away from my family just to go out there and take a written test, stand in line for hours and hours and hours, and then take this test and then get a thing in the mail that says you didn't pass. And then you got to take another one. And finally I figured out how to pass those. And then the next step is you wear your suit and you go and you do an oral interview in front of other firefighters. And I remember it had already been a long process. And I remember my first real chance I had at this interview. It felt like I was maybe getting close, and sat down. I went to all these fire stations, my friends that were firefighters, did all these practice interviews, and felt like, okay, I got this down. I showed up ready, prepared, and it went terrible. I remember my mouth was just so dry. I was sweating. I was stumbling over my words. They would ask me something, and then I would say something out of nerves and go like, why did I say that? I was so stupid, And then at the end, I was like, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. And I remember one guy politely said, we're going to interview a bunch of people, and someone will probably contact you. If we're going to have you go on, someone will contact you, and then maybe you'll go into the next part of the process. And I remember I was starting to get up, and one of the guys giggled and said, don't count on it. And all of them were kind of giggling. And I left like just demoralized. And I wanted to quit. I wanted to give up right then and there and do something else. So I know what that feels like to quit, to want to quit. Obviously I didn't. Worked out okay. But the reason I bring that up is because in this letter of 1 Thessalonians, a passage that we're going to look at today, Paul had to have experienced that. And it's relatable. And I want us to understand, like, what Paul's talking about is something we've probably all kind of experienced and can relate to. We have to understand that what mattered most to Paul was living his life as a steward of this good news, this news that Jesus was God, and he came to this earth. And he died so that he could rescue us from our sins and reconcile us, which is to put us in right relationship with God. It's what he's all about, is going from town to town, from city to city, telling people about Jesus, making disciples, which means like an apprentice, or a disciple would be a follower of a rabbi that was learning from him, a follower of Jesus, and planting churches. He wanted to be a good steward of the gospel that God had entrusted this message to him, and he just wanted to do a good job. And in today's passage, we're going to look at a moment when he had to have been tempted to quit, but he didn't. And we'll hopefully gain some insight as to how he was able to do this, to continue on, to find encouragement to continue on following Jesus, telling people about Jesus. Anyone in here stop telling people about Jesus because you just feel like it's not going to work? I don't have the right words. I don't have the right message. It's just like the culture's so changed, like people don't want to hear it. How many of you guys have just lost a confidence and a boldness to tell people about Jesus? It's very common. I think most of us, probably if we're honest, fall into that category. So I want to invite you to stand as we look at these things together in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 through 7. Paul is writing this letter to this young church. He'd only spent about a month there, planted this church, told them about Jesus, and then he got chased out of town, and so he didn't really get to tell them all the things he wanted to do. He didn't get to spend enough time with them, and then he wasn't sure how they were doing. He sent his partner Timothy probably a year or so, maybe a little bit longer. He sends his buddy Timothy to the church, like just see how they're doing. See if it's even there anymore. Might not be, right? And he gets this report back from Timothy. No, they're doing really good. So Paul writes him a letter. The second chapter, he goes, "For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God, who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from people either from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you, as a nurse nurtures her own children." You may be seated. So this morning I want to look at 3 things that we can learn from Paul about being stewards of the gospel. 3 things that we can learn from Paul about being stewards of the gospel. And the first one in your notes is this: don't give up on participating in gospel ministry. Don't give up in participating in gospel ministry. And so remember, as we're reading this, for Paul, every follower of Jesus should have as a top priority for their life participating in God's kingdom work. For Paul, to be a follower of Jesus was akin to being a worker in his kingdom, to being a part of the ministry, gospel ministry, or stewardship of the gospel. Or as Paul puts it, I was entrusted by God with the gospel. All of us could say that, couldn't we? God entrusted us with his gospel message, and therefore we need to be good stewards of it. We have a responsibility to steward it. In Paul's eyes, to be a part of the church is to be a participant. To be a part of the church is to be a participant. The way Paul writes is, and the way the Bible presents this, is to be saved is to be sent. To be loved by God is to become a person who loves God and loves others. And to be a part of his church is to be a participant. And sometimes that looks like staying connected when you're in a season where you just need healing or help in some way. You're still participating. Keep showing up. Ask for prayer. Join a community group and let them love you. When you don't have anything to pour in and you're in a season where you need to rest, come rest here. That's still participating. And sometimes that looks like giving sacrificially of your efforts and your resources. Joining a community group in class and loving others and being loved. Serving on a team. Making the first check that you write each pay period your tithe check. Like that's what the Bible teaches. It's called first fruits. Doing something nice for someone in need. Getting involved. Living your ordinary life with gospel intentionality. So remember Paul's whole thing, that he's just traveling from city to city, telling people about Jesus, making disciples, and planting churches. And then he would teach them that as disciples or followers of Jesus, everyone has a part to play. Everyone has a part to play. And it's not only good for the church and the mission of the church when everyone plays their part. It's good for all the people. It's part of God's plan for growing us up and making us more and more like Jesus is being a participant. I mean, when you think about prayer and a God who can just has the power with his words to speak in everything that's created, he really doesn't need that step, right? Of, oh, let's have you pray and participate somehow. And yet he chooses to do it that way. God doesn't need us to participate in order to get things done. And yet he's chosen for it to be that way. And so as we participate, we can know, like, I am doing God's will. This is the way God's created it to be. This is right. In Acts 16, so the book, we know the four Gospels talk about Jesus' life and his ministry, his death, his resurrection, and then his ascension. And then there's the book of Acts, and that's what came right after that. And so we see in the book of Acts a lot of Paul's ministry. He had 3 ministry trips that he took, and they're written about in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 16, we find Paul, and what is he doing? He's going from church to church, from city to city, he's telling people about Jesus, making disciples and planting churches. And he ends up in Acts 16 in the city of Philippi. And he goes like he does to every city, and he's telling people about Jesus, and some people are getting saved. A lot of people are saying no, they're rejecting him. If you're wondering, like, how did Paul do it? He was he just talked to people about Jesus, and a lot of people beat him up. And matter of fact, in Philippi, a couple people became Christians. A lot of people were angry at him. And then he's walking to church, every day because he's telling people about Jesus. And this demon-possessed lady, keeps following him. Tells us about that in Acts 16. And she's demon-possessed, and she has the ability, because she has these spirits, to know what's going on, like in the spiritual world. And she speaks it out all the time. And she has slave owners. She's a slave. And the slave owners are making money because people would come to her, and she would like give them spiritual insight, and then they would pay these slave owners. So she was a slave. She's being used by the Spirit and by these exploiting men. And it's interesting, Paul just gets annoyed with her. It doesn't say, and then Paul had compassion on this girl who's demon-possessed and probably has mental illness issue, however we would deem that today. He had compassion and then he healed her. No, it says he got annoyed. And so he goes, get out of her, to the Spirit. And it works. And the Spirit leaves her. And then the slave owners are mad at him because that was our business. She was our business. You're bad for business. And they start spreading a bad report on him. The Roman soldiers come and they take Paul, they beat him up really bad. They give him like a fake trial, and they put him in prison for the night so they could figure out what they're going to do. If you read in Acts 16, there's a crazy story where there's an earthquake and the doors open and a lot happens. You can read it for yourself. But at the end of the day, they let Paul go. They go, tell Paul to get out of town. And Paul goes like this, I'm a Roman citizen. what you did to me was illegal. And they got scared a little bit. Like, there was an injustice that happened to Paul, but he left. And so that's what he's talking about when he goes, you heard about how outrageously I was treated in Philippi. If you've ever experienced injustice, then you know it can often hurt more than physical pain. If you've ever had something happen and the system's broken and just takes something from you, or you just get treated unfairly. I had that happen to me as a paramedic, just trying to help people, and had a false claim against me, had to go to court. The judge actually ruled in my favor and said you didn't do anything wrong, and then the state still put me on a probation because like it just looked bad. They were kind of covering their own heinies, as they say, you know. And I'll tell you that was hard. That felt wrong. I felt wronged. I know many of you have been wronged much worse than that. But Paul had been wronged. It was injustice. And look what he says. In verse 2, he goes, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. How many of us, myself included, when we experience failure, rejection, injustice, or just great opposition, how many of us get discouraged? How many of us, when we pray for good things to happen, even in ministry, for ministry success, God, I'm here, I'm doing ministry, make it successful, help us see fruit. And then things don't go the way that you thought they were going to go. Or worse, they go badly. Things then feel outrageously unfair, don't they? God, why did you let that happen? Why didn't you answer my prayers? You ever been there? How many of us would be tempted to give up? Because that's exactly what Paul is experiencing. Like, you want me to go around and tell people about Jesus? Okay, just make it successful. Give me success wherever I go. You just got beat up and treated unjustly and chased out of town. It was treated outrageously. Where were you, God? Let me just ask this. When was the last time you wanted to give up on going to church? Or serving in ministry? Or following Jesus at all? Not only does Paul not give up, but he goes to Thessalonica, and it says, emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God. How did he do that? And later in this letter, Paul is going to exhort this church in the later chapters. He goes, do not grow weary in doing good. It's like one of his favorite things to say. He says it to the church in Galatia. He also says it in 1 Thessalonians. Don't give up on doing gospel ministry. Don't give up on doing good. Don't grow weary in doing good. And for Paul, this means do not give up on participating in gospel ministry. At church, don't give up on showing up. You know, somebody does something that you don't like, says something that hurts your feelings. I'm not saying don't let your feelings be hurt. I'm saying don't give up. In your day-to-day lives, don't give up on doing good. Live your ordinary lives with gospel intentionality. And then what you need to do, and it's the next thing in your notes, is this. Just be faithful and trust God with the results. Be faithful. Don't give up. Just be faithful and trust God with the results. Look what he says in verse 1. He goes, our visit with you was not without result. And that's profound, don't you think? Because you get the picture with the rest of what he's saying. This was not all good, as they say. Like, how are things going? It's all good. It was not all good. Paul got his butt kicked and got put in prison, and the justice system failed him. He was treated outrageously, all because he was just trying to do the right thing and participate in gospel. God, you sent me here to the Gentiles. Why wouldn't you make it successful? Why wouldn't you go before me? Why wouldn't you do all those things I want you to do? I'm just trying to do the right thing. And he's like, I got chased out of town. And then in Acts 17, Paul goes to Thessalonica. He tells them about Jesus. He's only there for a month. And then he gets chased out of Thessalonica. And not only that, it says, then he went to Berea, and the people from Thessalonica followed him. And so right away when he got to the Bereans, they were already like, he already had an enemies against him. He had opposition. It was not all good. After all that, he goes, our visit with you was not without result. The church in Thessalonica is still facing persecution. He keeps saying that. You're doing good, even though things suck for you right now. In a lot of ways. You're facing persecution. This one guy, Jason, if you remember in the book of Acts, this is in Thessalonica, gets torn out of his house because they're having house community group. Can you imagine going over to Frank and Sue's house and Frank gets pulled out in the street and beat up by a motorcycle gang because we're just doing church at his house? Like, that's exactly what happens to this guy Jason. And he's like, but it wasn't without result. His visit was not without result. God was doing something. Paul knew it. Paul believed it. Paul held on to it. It's not all good, but God is doing something. Do you ever get focused on what's going, so focused on what's going wrong that you forget to remember that there are some good things happening in your life? God is doing something. Just remain faithful. Trust God with the results. When the results don't look the way that you expected, what are you doing? You're trusting yourself with the results. Paul in this section is really saying, look, we came to share this simple gospel with you. We didn't say anything fancy and we didn't do anything fancy. He goes, for our exhortation, the message that we were giving, the encouragement that we were giving, the things that we were teaching you, it didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. What Paul is saying is, look, we weren't giving you some kind of like deceptive used car sales pitch gospel. Then he goes, for we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. I think Paul is saying here is like, we didn't come to Thessalonica with any special tricks up our sleeve. We didn't have a famous band. We didn't bring a celebrity preacher. We didn't do any gimmicks. We didn't do any giveaways. We didn't do any sales pitch. We just simply told you about Jesus. And it worked. It worked because a small group of them received the gospel and were growing to be more like Jesus. And they're imitating the disciple-making efforts now of Paul. But note, he just came from Philippi where he didn't have a super successful experience. Also note, he faced intense persecution and suffering in Thessalonica, and they're still experiencing that. It wasn't all good. But God was doing something undeniable, and Paul held on to that, and Paul preached that, and Paul's writing to remind them of that. Don't give up. God is doing something. Just be faithful and trust God with the results. If it doesn't look like the magazine tells you it's supposed to look like, that's not our metric. God is doing what God is doing. If you're being faithful, you're being successful. If you're being faithful, you're doing a good job. And we just trust God with the results. It wasn't without result. Paul was faithful and he trusted God with the results. And now he's thanking God that he got to be a part of it. He got to participate in the work of the gospel at Thessalonica, and he's stoked. If we give into the temptation to focus on the stuff that's going wrong or isn't going the way that we want, then we're going to have a hard time remaining faithful for very long, aren't we? So doesn't it make sense that that's the enemy's strategy? The social media, this is, look at how good everyone else is doing. No, they're not. They just have good filters on their phone. We need to learn to appreciate the good news stuff that God is doing in us and around us. And we need to learn to evaluate success or failure by faithfulness and not all those other things. Not the results that the world champions and applauds and tells you that, oh, you're doing good because. And here's the last tip that we learn in this passage, and honestly, it's a big one. He says, work for God's pleasure, not man's praise. Work for God's pleasure. Don't give up. Be faithful and just trust God with the results. Work for God's pleasure, not man's praise. And it's so important that he actually says it twice in these few verses. He goes, we didn't do this to please people, but rather God, who examines our hearts. He knows our hearts. And then in verse 6 he goes, and we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. There's this great children's story written a long time ago. We read it to our kids often. It was by Max Lucado, and it's called You Are Special. Any of you guys read that book? You Are Special. It's a book, it kind of is a play off of the Pinocchio story. Pinocchio was a wooden character. In Max Lucado's story, they're the Wemmicks. And the Wemmicks are all wooden creatures. And they give each other gold stars or gray dot stickers. That's how this community works. So there's these wooden Wemmicks, and one of them is named Punchinello, like Pinocchio, right? But Punchinello. And Punchinello has a ton of gray dots. And so what it works like is if people like you, if people, it's like social media. If they like you, they give you lots of likes, they give you lots of attention, and they give you gold stars. If you're beautiful, if you're talented, if you're in shape, if people like you, gold stars. And the more gold stars you have, everyone else goes, oh, everyone else thinks they're great. Well, I'll give them some of my gold stars. So some people are walking around with all these gold stars. Some people are walking around with all these gray dots. That's for the opposite. People don't like you. They don't think you're doing a good job. They want to kind of insult you. They want to under your breath say, good luck, right? When you're leaving your interview. Gray dots. And Punchinello has a bunch of gray dots. He's feeling pretty bad about himself. And then he meets this young lady. Everyone's got dots or stars or mix. And he meets this young lady named Lucia. And Lucia doesn't have any gold stars or gray dots because they don't stick to her. And Punchinello doesn't want any stickers on him either. So he asks her, how did you get to the place where the dots and the stars, they don't stick to you? And she said, oh, I met our maker. His name's Eli. She said, every day I go to Eli's workshop And he's happy to have me spend time with him. And I just spend time with Eli every day. And after a short while of being loved by Eli, the dots and the stars just started falling off. And Eli invites Punchinello to visit him. And he does. And all of a sudden, a couple gray dots fall off of Eli in the story. And then it says, Eli invites Punchinello to visit him every day and learn to just be loved by his maker. And over time, he will learn to not be bothered by what other Wemmicks think. And then the stars and dots will not stick to him either. I'm going to have the worship team come back up. How is Paul not discouraged to the point where he wants to quit, or he does quit, when he's facing so much failure and rejection and hardship? He spends a lot of time with his maker. Spends a lot of time with his maker. And so he's able to say, hey, came to town, it wasn't all good, but all the rejection doesn't stick to me right now because I'm not living on man's praise. I'm living for God's pleasure. And I see that there is some result. So I'm going to keep going. I want to encourage you to keep going. This is working in God's time. Don't give up. Just be faithful. Trust God with the results. Live for God's pleasure, not man's praise. As we prepare to worship this morning, I think the response is obvious. Let's just spend some time with our Maker. Ask him to continue to heal us if we need healing. Encourage us if we need encouragement. Restore us where we need restoration. And just ask him to help us be loved by him so much that the dots and the stars of this world no longer have power to stick.